All right, we are in Illustrator. We are taking our refined sketch, this one that we posted for assignment 4, and we are opening it in Illustrator. I'm just going to show you that setup again. But this is your refined sketch. This is not your refined sketch. If you just post an outline sketch to Illustrator, you're going to be tempted to just trace your outlines, but that doesn't give you a logo, right? Logos are shapes. So you want to take the time to turn your favorite sketch into black shapes so that you know exactly what gets filled in and what shape they are. Then you bring that into Illustrator. And it seems so simple. All we're doing is using Illustrator to make a black shape. So if you open up an Illustrator, then we set it up as an onion skinned layer. So let me do this again. It just opened up the same thing because I have the same name. So let me make this a different name and then open that in Illustrator. It will open up as a new file. How do I set this up? And this is important because we want to see only black when we make black shaped vectors. I want to onion skin this. So I double click on the layer and it will say dim images 2. You click on that and I'm actually going to dim it more than 50%. I'm going to dim it to 20%. That's another reason why you really want to kind of clean up your refined sketch so it's black and white. So it's really clear what the shapes are that you're trying to trace. Now I'm going to lock that because this is my reference raster image. And on top of that, I make a new layer using the little post-it at the bottom of the layer column. And now I'll have red anchor points showing me what's next. So what I showed you at the end of the last video, I'll turn all of these off. They can all be turned on under Window. But we'll be using them in different ways later. But the most basic tool in Illustrator for making a path is the pen tool. And for tips on using the pen tool, which is what vector design is all about, if you go back to these slides, right, I give you some tips here, how to use the pen tool in Illustrator with this little cheat sheet. Basically, you plot anchor points, you can plot straights, or you can plot curves. You click and drag to make curves. But the problem is when you make a curve, then it's going to curve the next line you make automatically. It's called a counter curve. So you have to go back and click on the anchor point where you started it to get a straight again. But in that way, you can really make any complex two-dimensional shape. These are the different kind of notations on the pen tool you need to know. You need to close each of your paths. You don't want to have open paths because we're not going to use strokes. We're always going to use filled paths for our finished logo. Those strokes can be helpful while you're tracing. And then there's other things you can learn. These are like exercises. You can actually do things to control the width of stroke paths. You can add kind of vintage textures. But it all starts with just having vector shapes that you understand and vector paths that you understand. Now, one of my favorites is the blob brush. We'll be getting to this when we get to digital inking, but don't use the brush tool or the blob brush tool yet until you understand it. Instead, I'm going to try to teach you how to do this entirely with the pen tool and the pencil tool, right? So I showed you with this one how to use the pen tool to make straights, where you just click on the pen and then you start and you click to plot an anchor point. Illustrator has always been designed to be used with a mouse. So it's all about really precise clicking. Click, 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 click. And the defaults will give me a white fill and a black stroke. So as soon as it starts to cover up what I want, I might move over here and I might just say empty out with the red X. Make that fully transparent. Like no fill. So I'm just seeing the stroke. And then I plot. And this is polygonal. It's all straight. I'm just clicking and moving. I'm not holding it down at all. But I have to keep up with that until I can close the path. You see the little circle that shows up next to the pen tool. That means the path is now closed and it doesn't continue. At that point, I can swap it so that it has no stroke, but it's filled in. Don't worry about all the little red bumps. Those aren't really there. That's just showing me the anchor points I can play with. Now, how do I turn that into my design? Well, with the pen tool, I can hold down Command and select it, and then I can actually add anchor points where I want, and then I can move them where I want. And if I want to turn them into curves, I can use what's called the anchor point tool, which you can get to with the shortcut Shift-C. Whoops. And it seems simple enough, but it's really going to frustrate you until you get used to it. So I just turned that straight anchor point into a curve. And then I'm going to change this one into a curve to get the beak. Now that's the outward curve. I can also accidentally turn those handles on the curve around, and that really screws you up, right? So you really just want to understand what's happening, not getting little knots in it. Now the problem is each of these curves I plot, they're going to be equal distant on both sides, right? They're between two straights, and then you have an equal curve. But then I can use what's called the direct selection tool. I call it the small selection tool. It's not in Photoshop. I can use that to adjust each of the handles of the curve separately, right? To really give me the shape I want. I can also use that direct selection tool to move these anchor points, but I can't turn them to a curve unless I use Shift-C and this anchor point tool, right? Now, what if I want a curve just on that side, but a straight on this side? Well, then I have to hit Command, and then I have to bring this anchor all the way back to the center. And then I can convert this one to a curve. So that's, in some ways, easier to understand what you're doing, because you have straights and then you have curves, and you have full control all the time. I can turn this to a curve. And then I can hold down Command. Command will always give you the last selection tool you've used, and the most helpful for most of the process is the small selection tool, right? Where you can kind of move things and change things. And you can make the shape. The other method, which is the more professional, but you have to practice it, and that's what some of those slides are about, is that you can plot curves and straights at the same time. So if I start here and I want to do a curve from here to here, instead of clicking and then letting go, I click and hold and then drag. And it will pull out what are called the Bezier handles, and I can set the curve, both the length and the angle of it. Okay, now it's going to give me a curve back, and that's going to be really frustrating. So how do I get this back to a straight? I have to click, again, it's all about precise clicking. Click on the anchor point I just left, and you can see that the pen tool now has the little convert anchor point tool icon, and that means that converts it from a curve into a straight. And then I go to my next point, and then I drag it out as a curve. So what's really nice about this method is I'm controlling the curve on both sides. So I'm actually making fairly complex decisions. I'm curving it on one side and then straightening it on the other side. Curving it on one side. And for this design, that makes a lot of sense. And then straightening it. Now, if it's covering up what I want, I can always just swap it, right? So I see the stroke outline. And then I just continue. Now, sometimes you might want to keep the counter curve that it suggests for you, like that, because it's trying to give you kind of an elegant way out of that shape. But that doesn't fit my design, so I have to go back to a straight. And maybe I even want that to stay a straight. And then I'm going to go all the way down to here and pull that curve out. Now don't worry, I can modify it later, but this is a nice way to get the best of both worlds just in one pass through. Where you can avoid some of the most annoying things about using the pen tool in Illustrator. All right, so I've closed that path. Now I can modify it, again, with that small direct selection tool. The hard thing is I have to click on exactly that anchor. So the way to do that is not to select it like this. It's to click off of it and then hover over it until it shows. So you know that you're clicking on the anchor and not on a place between the anchors. And then I can drag it to where I want it. And then if I want to convert it to a curve instead of a straight, I can use the anchor point tool, right? And turn it from a straight into a curve like that. Or another option, which can be really helpful, which is another reason polygonal design is pretty cool, is if I select it, you see this little circle that shows up around it. It never gets bigger, but that is what's called the rounding tool. And what that will do is insert a secondary anchor point and split the straight anchor into a curve between two anchors. So it rounds your corner, which can be really nice. The other thing you can do is once you have it, you can see how this kind of works, but it's not all that smooth, is you can use what's called the smooth tool to just drag over certain things and average them out. So even though it might create extra anchor points, it's going to make those angles and those transitions more averaged. And then if I want to see what that looks like as a shape, I just swap it. So, what's the other tool you can use besides the pen tool? That is the pencil tool. Now the pencil tool, you want to double click on it and you want to set it to be either more accurate or more smooth. I like usually a tiny bit more smooth, but it depends. And I'm going to now use the pencil tool to draw the snake's eye. So with this, and you can do it with a tablet, but you can also just do it with a mouse or a trackpad. You start, and then just like you're drawing in Photoshop, but the tough thing is you have to close your path. And it will simplify it for you to some regard, and then you can fill it in. Now, for those of you doing central symmetrical elements, it can be very simple to just copy Command-C and paste your paths, right? And then if you want to transform them, you can use the large selection tool. It will give you a transform box around it. Then you can right-click within it. And then you can say transform, right? You can also just right-click it at any time and get to this transform. And this is going to, I want to flip it horizontal. But they don't have flip horizontal here. Instead, they have what's called reflect. This is from when it was owned by a different company. And so what I want to do is reflect it vertically, like a vertical mirror. And now I can move it into place. Now what's nice is when you move things in Illustrator, it knows you want to line things up for the most part. So it will give you these kind of guides to show you when they're lined up. All right. So now how can I turn this, how can I turn these into curves? I'm going to use the small selection tool, right? I could use the rounding tool, but you see if I don't click the anchor first, it's going to round all my corners, and I don't want that. So instead, I'm going to click just on that anchor point and then just round that one. So that's one way, and I can do that with all of these straights. You have to select them individually, and then you can round them. Another way is to use the pencil tool. So once you have the path, I can use the pencil tool and I can redraw it as long as I start on the path and end on the path.